Good morning, everyone. I hope your week has begun splendidly. Not much news happening over on this side. My parents are coming next week to visit us out east, so I'm trying to get a little bit ahead because I won't be able to do much next week. It's probably already in like the 30s back in Minnesota, and I do not miss that at all. But I do miss them, and I'm excited to see them. I'm mentally preparing to tell my mom that I haven't physically been grocery shopping in months. I'm sure she'll love that. Oh, also, I finally went on a date last week. It went really, really well. We bought some food, shared a joint, and then hung out again a few days later. She came over and I made grilled cheese in a panini press, which, if you haven't done before, is absolutely life changing. Done the same way, butter each side, stuff too much cheese in between. But it's so easy, you can't mess it up, burn it, much less of a cleanup, plus it's extra crispy. Anyways, the grilled cheeses turned out great, and then we started watching Ted Lasso. But then I noticed she would kind of just sit there and stare at me, which isn't the worst. I understand that. But it reminded me of my mother way too much. My mom just, it's out of love, but she just stares at me when I eat, and it kind of makes me uncomfortable. This would continue over and over that evening, and I just wasn't able to shake it, even though I know it's not that big of a deal. Simply a possible sign of endearment. Long story short, we didn't click on a few other more critical aspects, so we called it quits before it fizzled out and dragged on. But back to square one. Gotta love it. That's all right, though. More time for us folks to hang out and chat about spoopy whoopy dark things. Speaking of, my name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources today come from, as always, Wikipedia, Murderpedia, and then an article from CelebrateBoston.com. Such a fun and odd story today. Do any of you remember the weepy-voiced killer from Minnesota who would murder his victim and then call the police crying or weeping, saying he couldn't stop himself, that he was sorry, and then blah, 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 blah. But then he would proceed to do it again and call the police and cry to them. The story is very similar to that, just a different M state today. Today, I bring you the serial killer known as the Giggler. We begin in Boston on April 15th, 1967. Quote, 6-year-old Lucy Palmerin, originally from Puerto Rico, was sent by her parents to turn in a tonic bottle in a public housing project in Boston. When she failed to return home for dinner, her disappearance was reported to the authorities, who launched an all-out search for Lucy. They questioned numerous neighbors, searched various abandoned buildings and isolated areas, but were initially unable to find her. According to a playmate of Lucy, she was last seen climbing into a black sedan by an unfamiliar man. This greatly alarmed her family, as Lucy did not speak English and was not very well acquainted with anyone in the area. End quote. This poor family then had to sit and wait without any answers or leads or just a tip for over a month. And finally, on May 24th, 2 young adults that were headed towards Broadway Station on a walk came across something unfortunate. While crossing the bridge across the Fort Point Channel, they looked down and noticed something odd sticking out of some garbage in the channel. Quote, upon closer inspection, they realized that this was the body of a little girl. The finding was quickly reported to the authorities, who recovered it and brought it to a local mortuary, where it was positively identified as that of Lucy Palmerin by one of her brothers. Upon hearing of the discovery, Lucy's mother fainted and had to be driven to a hospital for treatment. Her death was listed as a drowning, but at the time, it was presumed to have been accidental, end quote. And this time, although they had their daughter's body, the family would have to wait for years for any real closure. Okay, skip ahead 2 years. On June 16th, 1969, Marine veteran Joe Breen went out to meet some friends for a drink at a bar in what was known as the combat zone. And this, quote, combat zone is completely unrelated to the Marines. It was just a name, quote, given in the 1960s to the adult entertainment district in downtown Boston, Massachusetts. Centered on Washington Street between Boylston Street and Neyland Street, the area was once the site of many strip clubs, peep shows, X-rated movie theaters, and adult bookstores. It had a reputation for crime, including prostitution, end quote. So, not the safest of all places to go out for a night, but as an ex-Marine, I'm sure Joe wasn't that worried. However, maybe he should have been. As the night went on, I'm sure his judgment and motor skills, let's say, softened. Feeling lucky, Joe took up a game of shuffleboard against a stranger that he had met at the bar. These two continued to drink and shuffle until the bar closed, and they ended up walking out together. Quote, sometime later, the pair got into a brawl over the cost of a bottle of liquor and the cab fare, whereupon the man pushed Joe into a water-filled pit and beat him on the head with rocks. He then went to the nearest phone and called the police, informing them about the body's location. He then said that it was the, quote, Giggler who was speaking, and promptly began to giggle, and then hung up. Breen's body was found on the following day at the described location, end quote. Okay, let's just take a moment to break this down. First off, I love the moniker, the Giggler, for a killer. Absolutely love it. But the fact that he gave it to himself almost ruins it for me. I feel like this could have been so much more natural. There's a huge possibility the press would have dubbed him the Giggler anyways after that phone call if it were released. But whatever. I still kind of like it. Back to what matters. This death, unlike the first of Joe Breen, is ruled a homicide. Police interviewed a few friends who had been out with Joe that night. They described the man playing shuffleboard with their friend as in his early 30s, wearing old clothes, average height, and quite pudgy. While police followed other leads, those good friends of Joe continued to frequent the same bar in that combat zone. And a few weeks later, one of those friends happened to spot the same man again at the bar. He immediately called the authorities, but unfortunately, by the time they had arrived, our mystery man had left. Okay, quick recap. Lucy's death in 1967 is ruled accidental. 2 years later, in 1969, we have a homicide ruling of Joe Breen's death, and police have zero clue that the two are connected. Zero. That same year in 69, quote, on November 27th, the body of 75-year-old Clovis Parker, an elderly woman who lived in the South End, was also found floating in the Fort Point Channel. She was identified via her identity papers, which were still on her body, and despite the similarities with Lucy's death 2 years prior, her death was also ruled accidental. End quote. This time around, there are clear connections to the first case of Lucy, but yet are not shockingly ignored, or unshockingly ignored. Is that a word? All three of these deaths remain separate, 2 of them getting closed quite prematurely. We're starting to heat up at this point. No more year-long breaks. Less than a month later, another kid goes missing. Quote, on December 26th, 9-year-old Kenny Martin left his home in Dorchester and went in the direction of South Station, where he planned to catch a train and go to his friend's house. End quote. Sadly, this would be the last time anyone saw him alive. And for 10 days, the police and his family wondered where the little boy might be. Eventually, while searching the basements of South Station, his last known location, investigators came across a canvas sack tied shut with a twine. Inside was the body of Kenny, later positively identified by a friend. It was this murder that would do our little Giggler in. Clearly a much more public place this time, he was spotted accompanying the boy by multiple witnesses the day that he had disappeared. Police obtain a description of the man and immediately issue a warrant for his arrest. After receiving an anonymous tip about the man, Police traced his location to the Biltmore Hotel in Providence, Rhode Island, where they subsequently arrested him the next day without any resistance. The man they arrested, the man calling himself the Giggler, Kenneth Harrison. On January 7th, Kenneth confessed to the murder of 9-year-old Kenny. He told police that he met Kenny at the South Station, convinced the boy to go bowling for a bit, and then brought him back to the station. Here, Kenneth brought the child to an office in the basement. What? Why did that sentence come out like that? Oh, God. Here, Kenneth brought the child to an office in the basement and proceeded to strangle Kenny with twine and left him to rot. Absolute monster. Here's the real kicker, though. So I've told you about 4 separate deaths, and police have Kenneth in custody for only one, the death or the murder of the 9-year-old boy Kenny. Kenneth and Kenny. Sorry, I hope you're keeping them separate. After he told police how he horribly murdered the poor boy, he then said this, quote, "As long as I'm here, I might as well tell you about a few more," end quote. I imagine the police officer's jaws just smacking the floor when he said this. And then Kenneth Harrison proceeded to confess to 3 other murders. The first one he admitted to, we already knew was a homicide. The Marine Joe Breen. Fuck, I hate accidentally rhyming like that. This one made the most sense to investigators. And then he tells the story of Clovis Parker. So according to him, quote, on November 26, 1969, a 75-year-old woman asked Harrison to escort her across the Broadway Bridge in South Station. Halfway across the bridge, Harrison punched her, flipped her cane off the bridge, and then picked her up and tossed the woman over the railing, end quote. I hate to make a joke right here, but I think I've literally done this in GTA. It's just so unnecessary cruel that I honestly can't see any other motive for this than sport, just for the fucking fun of it. It's so wild. This previous accidental death has now become murder charge number 3 under his belt. And just when police thought they'd heard it all, Kenneth Harrison drops the bombshell. If you thought Clovis had it bad, brace yourself for this. Quote, on May 24th, 1967, Kenneth Harrison was employed as a taxi driver at the time and offered to give a ride to a 6-year-old girl from South Boston. She sadly agreed. Later, on the pretense of giving the girl a piggyback ride, Harrison lifted her up and tossed her into the Fort Point Channel, where she drowned, end quote. What the fuck, dude? He's just, and with seemingly no target in mind, young, old, man, women, he's just out here throwing people off of bridges. I completely understand having intrusive thoughts. I get that. But this is beyond comprehension. That's crazy. Thankfully, this is where the confession stopped. Obviously, there could have been more, seeing as Kenneth supposedly had an urge to kill for years. But this is still obviously way more than enough to put that dirt devil away for life. The trial, a cakewalk. He didn't recant anything, and nobody liked the guy anyways. Except, well, there was this fun fact. So the anonymous tip called in that gave away his location to the police when he was arrested at the Biltmore Hotel, that tip came from Kenneth's sister herself. So, way to go. Clap, 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 clap. Your brother sucks. 2 thumbs up. And so, in November of 1970, Harrison was convicted of first-degree murder and given a life sentence. In 1972, he was given 3 additional life sentences for the other murders. Harrison was to serve his term at Walpole State Prison, but an apparent plea arrangement allowed him to serve at Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane. End quote. And for over a decade, almost 15 years, in fact, he remained here. Then, as was his knack for shocking people, he up and killed himself. Quote, sometime in early 1989, he was informed by staff members that he was due to a transfer to MCI Concord, after which Harrison supposedly spiraled into a depression. Despite this, he was left largely unmonitored. On April 20th, 1989, Harrison was found slumped on the floor of his room by staff members and quickly transported to St. Luke's Hospital in Middleborough, where he subsequently passed away. End quote. I say good riddance. Although it would have been nice to see him suffer even longer, it's nice to know that he's gone from the face of the earth. There was a whole discrepancy about how he was left unattended and he shouldn't have had the opportunity to kill himself, but back in 89, I'm not sure they really cared much to keep him alive. So, there you have it, folks. That is the story of the serial killer known as the Giggler. I hope you enjoyed that. If not, I'm truly sorry you sat there and listened to it. A bit shorter episode today, but that's all right. I'm drawing a blank for anything else fun to say. Okay, bye-bye. I love you.